ready to go. It is wonderful to see everybody here. I was actually getting a bit nervous when I see all the faces and all the names popping up here. I guess we are all a bit unused to seeing each other and communicating with a lot of people here. But I'm happy that we are here and that we can do this. My name is Linda Nilsson and I am in the board of WFAD. And I am, as I said, very happy that we can do this. WFAD is a member organization, and I think most of you are members of WFAD, and if you are not, I welcome you all to join us in our very lovely family of WFAD organizations working in one way or another around illicit drugs. We had webinars before, but we had maybe a bit of a pause in that. But I hope that we can continue to do this kind of webinars, to go in depth and find other ways of meeting. Since we are a worldwide organization, it's not, even though right now is special circumstances with Corona, we still need to find ways to meet across the borders. So I'm happy to do this today. And one thing that I would like to stress is that we all welcome if you have ideas for webinars that you want us to do around topics, or if you have special ideas about good stuff that you are doing that you want to share, please send us an email or contact us. You have many different ways of contacting us, so we can continue to do this lovely ways of gathering around webinars. We are quite some people here today. Regina here will mute you all. She's waving there right now. And in order for us to, be able to listen to the person who is speaking. There are a couple of ways for you to ask for the floor. Either you can use the chat. You can also raise your hand if you find that way. So please use that and we welcome all questions in the chat and we will try to deal with them. We are set up to do a webinar for 1 hour. We will keep that and finish at 2 o'clock. But we will also keep this open if you want to continue the discussion afterwards for you who have time. I mean, you're perfectly welcome to hang around a bit after to do what we usually do over a coffee, maybe after a seminar. So please do that. We will send out a short survey after just to ask if you have any comments, and we will also ask if you have any other ideas for webinars in the future. But you can also, of course, send us a normal email on info@wfad.se. So please do that. And if you have any other comments or questions after the webinar that you come up with tomorrow morning when you wake up, send us an email and we will forward that to the speakers, so try to answer it ourselves. You can send it to Regina, to me, or to the info email at WFAD. Today we will talk about recovery, and more specifically around recovery cities. We have a few excellent speakers here to share their experience and knowledge. I am extremely happy to have you all here and that you're willing to be part of this. And I will not speak for any longer right now. I will hand over the floor to Mulka, who will lead us through this hour and keep track of everybody. So Mulka, please, the word is yours.
Thank you, Linda, and hello everybody. My name is Mulka Nisic and I work with WFAD members Celebrate Recovery as a regional project coordinator in the Balkans. And today it gives me a great pleasure to welcome our first speaker, Professor David Best. He's a professor of criminology at Department of Criminology at Derby University and visiting associate professor at Australian National University, I think. Yes.
Yeah.
And David holds multiple degrees, also a PhD in psychology of addiction, and he authored 7 books and more than 200 publications, book chapters and papers. But his current research is around recovery pathways, recovery capital, recovery and resistance, and also building recovery cities. And thank you, David, so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And I would like to start this your speech with actually it will be kind of an interview form of interview. And the first question I want to ask is, in your opinion, what is recovery and why is it so important?
Okay, recovery is essentially the process of people achieving a number of different things. So abstinence or sobriety is a big part of this, but it's by no means the only part. So recovery is generally thought of as having three core pillars. One is about general health and well-being, so generally improving physical, psychological health. The second is about abstinence or controlled use of substances, and it's quite contentious. But I think the evidence is really clear that for the vast majority of people, at least some period of complete abstinence is a necessity for recovery. And the third is citizenship, because one of the things we know is that for people to recover, they have to become active. They have to become actively involved in their own activities, in their community, and frequently the key kind of milestones of moving to recovery are successful job, safe housing free from threat, and some kind of a transition to positive relationships and social group involvement. So it's complex, and it's a process that takes place over time. So recovery doesn't happen overnight, and there's a common mistake that when people achieve abstinence, they have recovered. They haven't. From that, that's really the starting point of the recovery journey. We generally argue that it typically takes about 5 years from that point till somebody achieves what we would call stable recovery, which is the ability to self-sustain recovery without external support. What the corollary of that is that over that 5-year window, people will need supports. And the whole of the recovery movement, culminating in recovery cities, is about what those supports should look like.
Definitely. So this idea of recovery cities, where does it come from? It really excites me because when I first heard about the idea of recovery cities, I was fascinated, and I had never heard of it before, and it kind of stuck a chord in me. And I wonder if you can explain a little bit more about the idea and what you mean when you say recovery cities.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it starts from the assumption that only a very small number of people can do recovery themselves. What's called natural recovery. They recover without any external help or support. For the majority of people, recovery is a social process. So it requires assistance from family, from friends, from communities, and crucially from communities, because part of the recovery process is the capacity and ability to access community resources. Access to jobs, to houses, to mutual aid groups, to recovery groups. And one of the things I think that we've learned is that what typically happens is people have to build the resources for recovery over time, and we call that recovery capital. And recovery capital is both something that exists inside people, but also something that happens between people. It's something that's a social process. And there are areas, cities, neighborhoods, which are more receptive to recovery than others. And we can learn about what those fertile grounds are, and we can try and promote them. And really the start of the idea of Recovery City was that there are some places where there are more access to visible recovery champions, better treatment services, more opportunities for housing, for jobs, and less stigma and exclusion. So less laws stopping people reintegrate, that are more likely to enable recovery to be completed and to be successfully transitioned. Yeah. One of the things that's important about the idea of a recovery city, though, is that we can start to translate those ideas so that it's not just about addiction recovery, it's much more about inclusivity, and particularly now when we're talking in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic, we can start to see how vulnerable, isolated groups can benefit from some of the things we know about addiction recovery, about the importance of positive social networks, the importance of belonging, the importance of a positive self-identity and connections to people who can help you along the way. And that really started the idea that a recovery city is an inclusive city, not just for addiction, but for all kinds of excluded, marginalized and vulnerable groups.
And can you also tell us more about the core principles of recovery cities?
So it starts from some basic assumptions. The assumptions are that people will typically have limited resources and supports to start with, either because they never had them or because they lost them over their addiction journey. They need to access resource. And that process is an interpersonal process, that it takes groups, institutions, organizations, and individuals. And that one of the core concepts is that in communities, there are assets out there that can be tapped into and accessed to enable recovery pathways. And one of the core underlying processes is the question of how do we access recovery pathways and how can we mobilize those resources in communities to make that process more likely. And doing so, to return to the idea of recovery capital, there's two different ideas happen there. One, the first thing is that as people recover, their recovery capital grows. But as lots of people recover, so the recovery capital in a location grows. Because as a very famous academic called John Braithwaite once said, recovery capital and social capital aren't like financial capital. So with financial capital, as we sadly all know, you have money, you spend it, there's less of it at the end. But social capital doesn't work like that. When you deploy and use your social capital, there's more of it at the end. So as recovery capital grows in individuals, so it grows in the communities. And that really is the fundamental principle. So it relies on the idea of there being assets that need to be mobilized. And to mobilize those assets, we need a core group of people called connectors, community connectors. And they're in every community, because I've done this work now in different continents. I do it currently in Australia, in New Zealand, in the UK. And we had the pleasure of doing it in Belgrade towards the end of last year. And it's about how do you identify those natural connecting champions who know people, who know assets, who can create those kind of connections. And I think the last fundamental and underlying principle is there is generally a huge amount of goodwill that could be tapped into in communities, that can be mobilized to make cities and communities more accessible, more equitable, and more fair places for people attempting these journeys.
Yeah, I also had a question about examples of innovation in this approach. Do you have some models already?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there are at least 4 good examples of where this is happening. So the 4 cities, and you may want to talk about what's going on in the Balkan region because the meeting we had was really exciting. But I think one of the best examples was the visit we did to Gothenburg. So we went to Gothenburg to launch the Recovery Cities Initiative, led by Linda Nielsen. We visited one particular area and looked at the opportunities there. We then hosted a city centre event in the Ullevi Stadium in the centre of the city. And that prompted the generation of a group of people, and it was incredibly well attended. There was a huge level of enthusiasm. A number of people volunteered to become community connectors and have started taking that forward. And there have been recovery celebrations in Gothenburg. And likewise in Ghent in Belgium. And the other place I guess I wanted to talk about as a really good example is close to me is Doncaster in England, where we've had 2 big things that have come out of this. One has been a recovery college, a kind of training support event for both peer mentors and champions and people working in the recovery area in the UK. And the second is the Recovery Games. And the Recovery Games really captures the spirit of recovery cities. Because the idea of so it's a kind of sports day event where teams from recovery communities from all over the UK gather in Doncaster and they take part in a range of sporting activities. And the point is not about the winning. The point is about taking part. They're like recovery walks because we aim to do a number of different things with these. The aim is partly around celebrating people's own recovery journeys. It's partly about creating new, warm, positive connections among people in recovery. It's partly also showing local populations that people can and do recover, to challenge stigmatizing attitudes and perceptions. It's also about for people who are in addiction to say, this is possible. You may not think it's possible, but look at these people having fun, getting on with things, enjoying themselves. this is possible for you as much as it's possible for them. So it's kind of the whole point about recovery cities is to have big events that effectively bring people together, create a positive social identity for recovery, challenge stigma and exclusion. And it does it in two ways. And I think the event in Belgrade, like the event in Gothenburg, like events in our other places where we do this, Dublin and Doncaster, has really been around saying, how do we get both the grassroots activity to be connected in a meaningful way, and how do we link it to strategic leaders in communities so that there's both a top-down pressure and a bottom-up pressure that meets in the middle. And that the attempt of that model is to effectively create positive human connections and bring people together.
Yes, so let's just say that maybe some cities would like to join, and what would the city have to do to become a recovery city?
Well, we will attempt to support any city as much as we possibly can. We are still a really fledgling organization. So from our point of view, we want to be flexible, because I think the first thing to say is, this is not a McDonald's franchise. We're not going to say, here are the activities that everybody has to do. What we want to do is to say, identify your own assets and strengths. And we will send, if anyone is interested and you email any of us, we'll send you the overview and documents and the published research on recovery cities. And that will give you the guidance on how to do it and what to do. But more importantly, I think, we would work with you to say, what are the natural assets you have? Who are your natural champions, and how do you bring them forth? So I know that, for example, there was an initial idea for both Ghent and Gothenburg to try and replicate the recovery games that we have in the UK. But it transitioned in Gothenburg into something else, a kind of recovery festival event. And that's good, because that effectively fits with what your city does and what it has, and you want to build on those events. So I think our view would be the aim should be 4 activities or events a year. And at least one of them should be a kind of launch event where you try and mobilize and engage people to become connectors for you and to mobilize and free up assets. But what the others are really is just a mixture of where you tap into the existing resources. So things like conferences are good, but also to support in the spirit of recovery. They are things that should be held in public spaces that are accessible and available to everybody, that allow people to have fun and allow people to see that recovery is a positive thing. And that can effectively enrich the lives of all the people who take part. That's key. And ultimately, what we want a recovery city to be is a vibrant part of the well-being and the overall cultural capital of whatever city it takes part in.
Yes. So what is inclusive about this approach?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because I will frequently change my language from talking about recovery cities to inclusive cities to recovery cities to inclusive cities, and that's deliberate. And part of the reason is that there are really 2 primary purposes which hugely overlap. In the first instance, the aim is to both celebrate people in your local community or city who have recovered or are recovering, and to mobilize them to help other people to do the same. So point 1 is about addictions and addiction recovery. But much more importantly and much more broadly than that is, how do we then generalize that to say, how do we make the city a better place? As I've said, social capital spreads. There's a contagion of hope. And our aim is to say, as people become better connected and as hope generates and manifests, so we then want to say, how do we then translate that to other individuals and other groups so that potentially we could target, because the model is transferable. It would apply equally to people with mental health problems, with physical disabilities, with learning difficulties, asylum seekers, refugees, any marginalized, excluded group. The whole principle of saying, what are the assets? How do we mobilize the assets? How do we connect people to those assets? And how do we utilize that to create this notion of collective community capital where everybody benefits? And one of the things we've known for a long time from public health science is that the more groups people belong to, the better their health, the better their well-being. So for at least 10 years now, we have known from meta-analytic research that becoming connected to new groups and new activities is better for your health and well-being than any one of losing weight, stopping smoking, or stopping drinking. Connectedness, all forms of human connectedness, are absolutely at the heart of the model. And as we're seeing now, with incredibly innovative things people are doing online, the notion that crisis can provoke that collective spirit and can change people's lives and make people's lives stronger is crucial to what we want to do.
Yeah, that's kind of what you said in one conference, Goya principle.
Yeah, Goya principle is, I'm afraid, not a particularly sophisticated principle, but the idea is, and it applies to clients in recovery, because Goya stands for get off your arse, as in the Spanish painter Francisco Goya. Now,
Yeah.
why is that important? Because the evidence is really clear that when people start doing things, their well-being goes up. Their physical health, their mental health, their quality of life, it all goes up. But it doesn't just apply to clients, it applies to workers as well. One of the things that in my own training, I trained as a psychologist in a large teaching hospital in South London, that we would sit behind the desk and dispense wisdom to people, and we were astonished that very few people ever got any better. Because while therapy has a place, on its own, it's completely inadequate. We need to get out there into communities and mobilize those communities to link people into those things that are helpful for them. 12-step groups, therapeutic communities, smart recovery groups, but not just things like that. Sport, recreation, education, training, employment. You know, for lots and lots of people, the journey to recovery is partly about discovering they're not stupid. So somewhere in the recovery journey, they go back to college and university, and they thrive and they excel and they do really well at these things. For other people, they discover they've got musical or artistic or sporting gifts. And that's really why recovery is not, in this world, isn't about going back to where you started. It's really about growth, personal growth. So the whole notion of recovery is to create a city that maximizes the opportunity for vulnerable and excluded people to achieve their potential.
So how do we build on what is already there?
Well, the first question is, you have to find out what is already there. And I guess I learned my lesson from this in Australia. So I was invited by 2 judges in Southeast Melbourne to come and do some work with them on motivational interviewing, basically because they had a group of young drinkers and drug users who were repeatedly before the courts. And I said to them, what you need isn't motivational interviewing. What you need is stuff for them to do, meaningful pro-social activities that changes how they see themselves, the groups they belong to, and what they want to achieve and aspire to. So what we did was that the judges, Greg and Pauline, organised a series of morning teas in the courthouse in Dandenong, which is a fairly deprived area of southeast Melbourne. And they invited a whole host of people. And the formula we tend to use is we invite organisations from employment, training and education as the first cluster, recovery groups, so things like Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Smart Recovery. We invite people from sport, recreation and art groups, and especially early in recovery, that physical well-being is so important. Getting exercise, getting fit, getting healthy. So things like cookery clubs are perfect. Yoga, mindfulness, anything that allows people to do those basic things of physical well-being and psychological well-being. And then volunteering, because the other crucial part of this is not everybody's going to step straight into a job, but giving something back and committing to that spirit of giving something back is crucial. So in essence, the starting point is to say, the 4 groups of things: education, training and employment, sport, recreation and art, recovery groups, and volunteering and community involvement activities. You want to host an event and invite as many of the local organizations involved in those things as possible. And that might well involve a number of things like local churches, because they will frequently already be doing a lot of that work. The point about inclusive cities is not to reinvent the wheel. We're not claiming this is a radical new idea of things that nobody's ever done before. The point is about how they're linked and coordinated. So the key event as we've had in Doncaster and as we've had in Gothenburg and as we've held in Belgrade, is then to start to say, how do we get these people to link to each other, to create pathways into their community resources? And those resources will typically take three forms. There'll be key individuals, there'll be informal groups and associations, and there'll be structured organizations. The aim is to mobilize those things to allow people to make significant changes over time. And what you also find is that some people will come and never come back. They'll just come once and they'll not be interested. But the people who are engaged and are interested, the group of them becomes a new asset in itself. It becomes a kind of rallying cry and uniting force for people who are committed to this vision. So actually mobilizing resources, you create a new resource. And the most important part of that resource is you identify key people who share your vision, who will work with you. And that's how you build on what's already there, not by replacing it or replicating it, but by coordinating it and mobilizing it. And then crucially, what you then have to do is work out, how do you build those bridges? How do you build those connections to community activities and community events? Because as we know, people in the early stages of addiction and lots of excluded and marginalized groups have very low self-esteem, they have low self-belief, and they struggle to engage externally. So what you have to do is find people who and we call this the principle of assertive linkage. You have to find people who can positively, enthusiastically, and support everybody to get involved in those groups. Because bear in mind, and this all comes back to the starting point, which is this is not a replacement for specialist drug and alcohol treatment. This is something that builds on beyond that. This is something that supplements, because from the moment somebody gets clean, all that acute clinical work is done. We have 5 years where the person needs to get effectively integrated and engaged. We know that in the first year after somebody detoxes, the likelihood of relapse is more than 50%. If they make it to 5 years of continuous sobriety, the likelihood of relapse is 14%. What's the point of supporting people in recovery journey is to get them to that point. And you do that not by medicines or talking therapies, but you do that by effective community support that allows people to build those internal personal resources.
This partly also answers my next question, but what do you think, what impact will recovery cities have on addiction recovery and more generally?
Yeah, I mean, when I started studying recovery, and over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, I've collected about 2,500 recovery stories in the UK and Australia and America and New Zealand. And one of the things that's always struck me is how many people have to find their own pathway because there is nothing out there. The point about recovery cities is firstly to ensure that recovery is visible, vibrant and accessible, and that as early as possible recovery can reach out to you, that you don't have to feel stigmatized and ashamed, because the whole point of these events is to challenge some of that exclusion and stigma, but also to allow the possibility for to say, well, we can build on this model and we can start to say, actually the whole community can become engaged in this much more inclusive thing, that people will feel better about themselves regardless of whether they have an addiction problem as cities grow and develop that inclusive quality. Because it's also important to remember that when one person is addicted, typically 5 to 6 will suffer: children, partners, parents, neighbors, and that the whole point is neither addiction nor recovery are things that exist inside one person. By challenging some of these exclusions and stigmas and building pathways to recovery, effectively, hopefully it creates prevention by providing early exit points in addiction careers, but it also provides that safety and support. And I think it's really important to say, this is about when people are ready for recovery journeys. This is not instead of treatment, and it's certainly not instead of any of those kind of early harm reduction interventions. This is a way of supporting people who commit themselves to this pathway to support them to achieve the goals they themselves will say they want.
That's wonderful. And in closure, I want to just ask you, how do we join?
Okay, well, contact any of us. This is an incredibly exciting initiative. So Mulka, Linda, myself, any of us would be more than happy to talk to you about how you become involved in this. Because we also are a learning organization. We are still at the point of saying, we will support you, but we want to learn from you. Crucially from us, and sorry, this is going slightly off the subject, but this is a strengths-based approach. We want to celebrate what is good. We do not want to sit wringing our hands about what's terrible and what's wrong and how badly things go. And so one of the things we know about having these kind of activities and events is they generate hope. And all of you have heard me say numerous times, as well as Goya, there's one other critical acronym we need to be aware of, which is CHIME. And it applies to professionals every bit as much as it applies to people in recovery. Positive connections to groups that are filled with hope, aspiration, and a radius of trust generate opportunities for positive identity, meaning, and empowerment. So, and for me, the whole point of this is, if people aren't interested, if people don't want to recover or don't support this, that's fine. But for us, it's a way to gather like-minded people together to build that fuel and that sense of hope and possibility, that possibility of not only transforming individuals, but transforming families and communities. And it's a big, bold vision, and that's why we've set this up. So how do you join? Just contact any of us. We'll do everything we can to support you in this pathway. This is a really exciting journey we are on, and I hope a couple of the other people involved will tell their own stories about how this has worked for them.
Thank you, David. And I know I'm speaking also on my and Linda's behalf that this work for Recovery Cities was really inspiring and exciting, and it just grows.
Yeah.
So thank you.
I think for your event in Belgrade, the event that you and Boro organised in Belgrade, for the event that Linda organised in Gothenburg, the most pleasurable part of this, from my perspective, has been that sense of generating energy, enthusiasm, commitment. And for anyone who is thinking, well, we do a lot of these things already, give this a go, have this kind of launch event, because you'll be astonished at the amount of energy and enthusiasm that results from it. So thank you very much, Mulka. That has been a real pleasure.